Thank you very much, Worshipful Brother Calver. That was it's an honor to be here. I haven't spoken at I spoke at a quarterly back in like 2012 or something before most of the current members of Esoterica were even members of Esoterica. So anyhow, tonight I'm going to be discussing some of the potential early influences on some of the symbolism and weird stuff in Freemasonry. So we have to start by talking about a little bit about terminology. Scholars of Freemasonry talk about the esoteric in Masonry in sort of like three different categories. The first is elements of Masonic ritual or lectures which are considered secret. In Oregon, we usually call these things not monitorial. They're either not printed in the ritual at all, or they are enciphered in a way that makes them secret, where you have to basically know a Mason to learn what's being said. The second way that things can be considered esoteric in Masonry is when there are meanings that are implicit more by design than accident in Masonic symbolism. I'm trying to think of a good example of this. Some of it would be such as when we have tools of architecture which are tied to virtues, and then we sort of give like an esoteric meaning to the virtue itself. And then third, which people usually get the most excited about, are any subjects that are generally included under the rubric of Western esotericism, such as Kabbalah, alchemy, Hermeticism, or other forms of mysticism, particularly those which gained popularity during the Renaissance period, which was just before Freemasonry became a thing. And these are good categories. These were outlined by Brother Sean Iyer, who has been a speaker here in the quarterly lecture series, but has written a great deal on Masonic esotericism. But the problem is that Masonic scholarship tends to be very afraid of the weird part of Freemasonry. The weird part of Freemasonry definitely exists, and typically is, you know, so tied to sort of like occult theories and occult development that it's almost impossible for outsiders to separate. But inside Freemasonry, we tend to not use the word occult. But we're going to tonight because I'm going to be speaking about Renaissance occultism, and we're going to get confused if I have to keep switching back between esotericism type 3 and occult. So we're going to use these definitions. Esoteric is knowledge and teachings that are intended for a select group of individuals who possess specialized or secret knowledge. And then for occult, we're going to talk about hidden or secret knowledge or practices related to supernatural or mystical stuff, frequently those things which are considered either taboo or transgressive in some way. Occult usually refers to things that must remain hidden, either because they cannot be communicated directly or clearly, or there is tradition that indicates that they must be kept secret for some other reason. So in this sense, the esoteric aspects of Freemasonry would include things like the secret elements of our ritual, the secret interpretations of our symbols, our modes of recognition, by which we mean, you know, passwords, the infamous secret handshake, other strange things such as our, you know, we have like question and response stuff that is sort of esoteric, but also things like our binding oaths and obligations, which are not spelled out explicitly in ritual. Meanwhile, the occult aspects of Freemasonry would include things that might seem kind of innocuous to a Mason, but would seem unusual to somebody from the outside, such as the way we talk about divine light, the Masonic doctrine of ascent, which tends to get sort of glossed over frequently, that is based on virtues in Jacob's ladder. And then the concept of symbols and architecture as a type of mnemonic technology, such as like the art of memory stuff that's embedded in Freemasonry. All of these would be sort of considered part of the occult aspect of Masonry, at least as I'm approaching stuff in this talk. Okay, so we have to ask things like, where did Freemasonry's esoteric and occult elements originate? This is one of the things that Masons love to speculate about the most. There are lots of theories from the most fantastical to the most mundane. You know, you'll hear people talk about Masonry dating back to King Solomon's temple, Masonry dating back to Adam and Eve, Masonry coming from the pyramids in ancient Egypt, heck, Masonry coming from Atlantis or aliens or things like that. Like, people love to speculate about this kind of stuff. But I think when you really look at it, the answer is that it didn't come from just one source. The occult aspects of Freemasonry came from all over the place and are kind of widely dispersed. So I was sort of looking at this. Eventually I'm going to get to the Renaissance, but as I was looking at this, I was kind of like, where did all of this stuff come from? So I sat and sort of spent some time with it, and I kind of made a list. Oh yeah, right, I forgot. My slides are two-dimensional. So before the 16th century, probably the main influences that ended up contributing to Freemasonry were the Roman Catholic Church, which has plenty of esotericism and strange symbolism embedded in it, some of which Freemasonry managed to inherit. The guild-based passion plays, which is probably where we got our legendary history relating to King Solomon's temple. The Italian Renaissance, which I'm realizing I misspelled here. Apparently, I did not run spell check on my slides, so you'll have to forgive me for that. Sorry. I do know how to spell Italian. It's not like that. But the Italian Renaissance gave us a lot of important stuff, like the reintroduction of Plato, the reintroduction of Neoplatonism, Hermeticism, all that kind of stuff. And then finally, Jewish Kabbalah probably did have some influence on Freemasonry in some way. We'll talk about that a little bit a little bit later. During the 16th century, the Protestant Reformation probably had the biggest impact on Freemasonry when it came to accidentally introducing esoteric and occult symbolism. Just because it brought about like a whole new wave of sort of like free thinking in Europe and strange thinking, and being secretive about how you thought. That was a really big thing that came out of the Protestant Reformation. Renaissance magic, which we'll talk about directly, and then Christian Kabbalah. As we get on further from what we're going to talk about tonight, in the 17th century, things changed a lot. We had the Rosicrucian manifestos were published, the scientific revolution happened, and there were a lot of changing attitudes towards religious tolerance that became infused into Freemasonry when it was sort of a socially progressive movement. Because Freemasonry, it turns out, kind of exists in a really, really strange time in history. The birth of Freemasonry happened kind of during the birth of the scientific revolution. In 1610, Galileo observed the phases of Venus, which was part of his proof that we didn't live in a universe where the Earth was the middle of everything. Just after that, the Rosicrucian manifestos were published, which are like an incredibly influential piece of mystical literature that kind of like changed the face of mysticism forever. Just after that, Elias Ashmole became a Freemason. And then we had the English Civil War, which ended with the Commonwealth of England. On the heels of that, we had the Rosicrucian manifestos being translated into English by Thomas Vaughan. Then the Royal Society was founded. Then religious freedom, religious tolerance, like started slowly and painfully to leak into England and English politics, and that was sort of the fertile soil that Freemasonry needed to be established. In 1717, modern Freemasonry began with, well, sort of modern Freemasonry, moderately modern, with the foundation of the Premier Grand Lodge of England. and things kind of developed from there. I put on here the Jewish Naturalization Act in 1753, where Jews were legally allowed to enter England, but the act only lasted a year, and Jews weren't legally actually allowed to come back into England until like the 1860s or something like that. But all of these things contributed to Freemasonry's place. Like, it became more socially acceptable to be tolerant of other religions. It became more socially acceptable to talk about these sorts of things. But also there was this strange mix of like the religious mystical symbolism of Freemasonry and this new yearning for scientific knowledge and sort of like the birth of the scientific revolution. It was a weird world. I think it's one of those things that it's kind of impossible for us to look back and imagine what it was like to learn how to think then. But we're going to go back further than this. We're going to go back before Freemasonry to the Holy Roman Empire in the 16th century. And the Holy Roman Empire was basically Germany and Poland today, but it was a political mess back then that we don't need to talk about, thankfully. And we're going to talk about this guy, Heinrich Cornelius Agrippa von Nettesheim. He was born at the end of the 15th century, and he died in 1535. He was one of those strange Renaissance geniuses. He was a physician, a legal scholar, a soldier, a knight, a theologian, an occultist. He wrote a lot of very interesting books. The one that I'm going to be focusing on is the 3 books of occult philosophy, De Occulta Philosophia Libri Tres. Agrippa was alive at the exact same time as Nicholas Copernicus. Copernicus was born a few years before and died a few years after. Both of them had their most famous work published like the year they died. So neither of them got the chance to read the other one's work. Agrippa never got the chance to experience a Copernican universe like we have, right? So his worldview was very strange and different. We're going to have to look at that in order to understand why he's so important. And one of the reasons I want to look at Agrippa for this talk is that he, first of all, was one of the very first Christian Kabbalists. His book, the 3 Books of Occult Philosophy, is basically a catalog of Western esotericism and occultism. And he's had a really, really long-lasting impact. The 3 Books of Occult Philosophy have been basically republished and retranslated and republished and retranslated and stolen from and printed with different names since, for almost 500 years. They've been... It's been in print for a long time. He also had a really big influence on modern occultism, which, as we will see, kind of skips Freemasonry and sort of lands in the era of like the Golden Dawn and that sort of stuff in the 19th century. But his ideas are interesting. We'll get to that in a second. We have to try to understand his world, though. In order to know why Agrippa thought the way he did and why some of his ideas percolated the way we did, we have to get a picture of Agrippa's world. He lived before Galileo and before Copernicus, before the telescope, before there was really any proof or any concept of a non-geocentric world. In Agrippa's world, the Earth was the center of everything. The cosmos, the universe, was very, very small. There was no concept of an infinite universe that was widely accepted. Today we grow up in a world where we are taught that the universe is infinite, that it's 4 billion years old, or however many billion years old. 16 billion years old? The Earth is 4 billion years old. The universe is 16 billion years old. These are numbers that are impossible for us to fathom or work with. We grow up in a world where humanity is a tiny, insignificant speck on a tiny, insignificant speck in a giant, infinite, expanding universe that makes us, innately aware of the smallness of humanity. But that wasn't really the case in Agrippa's world. In his world, the earth was the entirety of matter. Everything was here. Like everything that existed fell down sort of an Aristotelian hole to land in earth and be in existence. There was this concept that the planets, which moved across the sky and looked like stars, were embedded in weird crystal spheres that may have been only like a couple hundred miles above us. There was no idea of how they worked. The world was very tiny. The universe was very tiny. This is a picture of the pre-modern cosmos, where you literally had like a ceiling of fixed stars. And then the visible planets below it, all in fixed spheres that made the Earth incredibly important. So that transition, that shift from geocentric to heliocentric, was fairly dramatic and traumatic. Galileo got censured, Giordano Bruno got burned at the stake. Like all this stuff happened when people started to be like, oh no, wait, I think the Earth is moving. So it was tough. We started to get these mathematical geniuses coming out, looking and observing the world. The birth of the scientific revolution, or the scientific revolution, was driven by observations of the heavens and these applications of math to the way planets moved. Like, go try to figure out how Kepler and Newton figured out their mathematical stuff, and I promise you, it's not easy. I can't do it. I can't figure out how they figured their stuff out. But it did turn into this world that was based on empiricism, where observation became sort of the foundation of knowledge. So we weren't looking at, for instance, ancient teachers to teach us things. We weren't looking at scripture to teach us things anymore. We were observing the universe and starting to measure and look at things in different ways, which is the world that we live in now. It has changed the way that we think fundamentally. So it makes it hard to identify and appreciate the genius of thinkers before this time. Another thing that's happened because of this is we have developed a really strict split between the metaphysical and the physical. We think that they are two different things. And a lot of this comes from spiritualists or spiritual people who are also empiricists, thinking that they could do things like measure the soul or measure the weight of the soul or measure consciousness or all of this kind of stuff. And that kind of messes us up. It makes talking about this stuff kind of weird sometimes, because we don't want to say to people like, science is bullshit or anything like that. Wait, can I swear? Can you bleep that, Brad? All right, so with this context, what I want to do, when I first set out to write this talk, what I really wanted to do was find like a direct line of transmission, so I could find ways that Agrippa's ideas and Agrippa's thoughts like directly influenced Freemasonry. It turns out that that's very difficult to do for a couple of reasons. First, we don't have a whole lot of information about the beginning of Freemasonry, so we don't really know all the people who were involved. Second, Agrippa's work was so popular that it was republished over and over and over again, and it was basically always available. Like, you pick a smart person from the end of the 16th century, and they probably copied some of occult philosophy into one of their books. So we know that like everybody read Agrippa. He was very, very popular. So I'm going to take a look at a couple of core concepts from Agrippa's work and see how they may have been interpreted in a way that may have influenced Freemasonry. Some of this may be a little speculative, and I totally encourage you to throw vegetables at me if it gets too speculative. I'm going to start with divine light. Now, Freemasonry loves the concept or the metaphor of light. And we'll talk about that in a second. But we have to talk about Agrippa's approach to this first. Now, first, he was, before the scientific revolution, before Newton's work on optics, there was no real understanding of light as a particle or a wave, or even that those sorts of things existed. Agrippa looked at light literally as something divine, and not in a necessarily metaphorical way. Light was something that moved from a divine source like God down through all the layers of the crystal spheres, down through Saturn and Jupiter and all that kind of stuff to reach Earth. Now, when it reached Earth, it wasn't like the light that you're seeing with. It was a light that your mind perceived. It was a light that entered into your consciousness. Now, each planet, each crystal sphere had sort of a nature that was tied to the planet, where the divine light would be absorbed and then retransmitted. So every iota of light or every instance of light that reached your consciousness had filtered through all the different planets in different ways to sort of influence and interpret how you were perceiving the world around you. So Agrippa wrote about the senses as both outer and inner senses. The outer senses are your physical senses, your sight and your smell, your sense of taste, all those sorts of things, the same senses that we use today. The inner senses are those that operate directly on divine light. They receive the divine light and manipulate it and basically enable you to use your outward senses to see the rest of the world. He was a little, his theory wasn't complete. He had sort of this vision of eyes as flashlights, which he also sort of acknowledged didn't really work super well. But his inner senses are kind of interesting. First, there was the common sense, which is responsible for collecting impressions and information from exterior senses, from your external senses, in the form of images. Second is the imaginative power, which retains and sort of solidifies those images in your soul and passes them along to the third sense, which is fantasy and the power of thought. Your fantasy accepts images from the imaginative power and then perceives and judges the nature of images. And then finally, the fourth sense is memory, which receives the images from the fantasy and then protects and stores those images. The memory also has a power to sort of distinguish, connect, and perceive images in its own way. So to Agrippa, divine light interacted with real light, possibly by passing through consciousness and then being projected outward, or possibly by existing as a sort of like purely metaphysical light that was then interacting with the physical light from the physical world. The most interesting thing about it is sort of this emphasis on image and memory, which I think is pretty nice. So Freemasonry, on the other hand, uses light as a metaphor kind of throughout its ritual and throughout its symbolism. Frequently, light is a metaphor for knowledge or wisdom, and it's sort of kind of alternates between something being really abstract and something that might be kind of divine. Common phrases that you'll run into that use light in Freemasonry are being brought to light, talking about the transition of darkness to light, and even this concept of Freemasons as being the sons of light. There's even sort of a link between the concept of the Mason's word and divine light. And so one of the things I did is I kind of went through and collected some quotes from some prominent Masons that talk about light in different ways. So this first one, the aspirant enters on this search after truth as an entered apprentice in darkness seeking for light, the light of wisdom, the light of truth, the light symbolized by the word. So this is interesting. This, I think, is probably the most standard way that Freemasonry approaches light, where light is literally a metaphor for knowledge, wisdom and truth. But also the light symbolized by the word is an interesting concept. You'll want to remember that because we're going to talk about that a little bit later. The word is typically seen as the master's word, which is a lost secret in Freemasonry. J.S.M. Ward, who's a 20th century author, probably, wrote, it indicates that each soul comes from the place of light, from light itself, that is, from the very substance of God, descends through the gateway of dawn, and becomes incarnate in matter. This reads like a very poetic metaphor, but it is literally what Agrippa says. So it could be, now we know J.S.M. Ward was a fairly mystical Mason who wrote at the beginning of the 20th century, so it could be that he was just sort of like, no, I understand light in a more occult way, so I'm going to write about it for Freemasons like this. And then finally, I did find a great quote from Frederick Jennings, who was the Grand Orator for the Grand Lodge of Oregon in 1928. Freemasons are emphatically called the Sons of Light because they are, or are at least entitled to be, in possession of the true meaning of the symbol. Here again, light is a metaphor for knowledge, and the Sons of Light are apparently those who receive this knowledge of the secret meanings of symbols. Okay, so I think what we can see from this is that Agrippa's sort of concept, that his a concept of divine light, I don't think it necessarily made it literally into Freemasonry, but Freemasonry's attachment to light as a metaphor for knowledge is definitely kind of influenced by Renaissance ideas of like an occult form of light. Okay, now we're going to get on to everybody's favorite topic, Kabbalah. All right, so Agrippa was one of the first Christian Kabbalists. Christian Cabala was a tradition that began in the 1470s or 1480s. The exact origins of it are really murky. There's not a lot of history that has shown where it truly originally came from, but some of the first people we know that Pico della Mirandola, who was influential in the Florentine Renaissance, was one of the first Christian Kabbalists. Agrippa, Johann Reuchlin, and I've forgotten Giorgio's first name. Anyhow, these were sort of the first people to take Jewish Kabbalistic mystical texts and publish them in Latin so that they were available to the Christian world in Europe. There weren't really Hebrew professors available. Like, there were no teachers of Hebrew in Agrippa's time. Like, maybe later on in his life, I think the University of Paris and maybe Cambridge both got Hebrew readers or Hebrew scholars at some point. But these were people who were sort of delving into like really mysterious, unknown stuff. And they were the first ones to take sort of mystical texts and make them available to a non-Jewish community. It's important to understand, though, that this Christian Kabbalah is not the same as modern Hermetic Kabbalah or the modern Kabbalah that you're familiar with. A lot of that stuff came from like the Lurianic school of Kabbalah, which didn't exist until 40 years after Agrippa died at the very earliest. So this form of Christian Kabbalah, this early Christian Kabbalah, the big thing that it was really interested in was using Hebrew using secret interpretations of the Hebrew language as a oh boy, this is one of those words that I never have to say out loud. Hermeneutical tool for understanding Scripture. Sorry about that. You can fix that in post too, right? There was also a huge influence on divine names. Like if you read Agrippa's sections in occult philosophy on Kabbalah, he focuses really, really heavily on divine names and how divine names can be used and the meanings of divine names. There's also the idea of permuting names or permutations of names. There are tables and tables and tables in the middle of 3 books of occult philosophy filled with Hebrew characters with lots of descriptions of how to sort of like feed Hebrew words through this and permute them in different ways to find secret meanings hidden in Hebrew. And then finally, the calculation of names. So there are like 3 or 4 chapters that are all about taking like astrological charts and calculating those and producing divine names out of them, like transforming things into new Hebrew words, or even ways of taking biblical texts and calculating things out of that. So almost all of this was focused on divine names, the generation of new divine names, and the transformation of divine names in order to gain sort of like additional significance. It's heady and weird, and it's not comfortable, and it doesn't look anything like the sort of Kabbalah that people tend to be familiar with today. So there were definitely modern elements of Kabbalah that we're missing. There's really no emphasis on the tree of life. Like Agrippa mentions the 10 Sephirot like once, and they're just sort of a throwaway reference. Some of his sources that he was relying on didn't talk about the tree of life and the Sephirot at all, or totally mixed up what they were. There was no Zohar. So the Zohar is a foundational Kabbalistic text, which is hugely influential and kind of forms what Kabbalah eventually turned into. But there was no Latin or any translation of the Zohar available. The Zohar was, in fact, it's written in Aramaic, which means it was completely unavailable to Agrippa and other early Christian Kabbalists. And then third, since there's no emphasis on the tree of life, there's no mapping of correspondences to the tree of life, which is one of the core practices in like modern Hermetic Kabbalah. You always find sort of this idea of mapping correspondences onto the tree of life. So with that in mind, spotting Christian Kabbalistic influences in Freemasonry is possibly like less exciting than we want. I think that a lot of times when people look for Kabbalah in Freemasonry, they want to find like direct references to the tree of life, direct references to sort of the modern Kabbalah that we find today. And while that does exist now, a lot of that happened, a lot of that was a later development where people purposely introduced Kabbalah into Freemasonry later on instead of having it sort of part of its organic development. But we do have some interesting things, such as the use of Hebrew divine names in Freemasonry. We see this in the Holy Royal Arch. We see this in this concept of the light symbolized by the word, which I referenced earlier. And then in a lot of 18th century haute grade rituals, which are like high-level degrees, like early versions of the Scottish Rite and things like that. There's a lot of divine names used. Even more interesting, though, is that early Freemasons apparently believed or apparently taught a secret method for reading the Bible. And this is a lost secret. The earliest Masonic private oration that we have is from 1734. And it's all about, this guy is basically all about talking, he's analyzing sort of, I think he's analyzing one of Paul's letters or something like that. And he criticizes Paul a few times. He's like, Paul wasn't part of a lodge, so obviously he didn't have the secret method of reading the Gospels, and so blah, 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 blah. But this I think, is probably the best evidence of early Kabbalistic influence in Freemasonry, because Kabbalah, it turns out, is all about mystical interpretation of Scripture, mystical ways of reading the Bible and extracting different meanings out of it. So if early Freemasons were in some lodge teaching secret methods of reading the Bible, I wouldn't be surprised if it was some form of Kabbalistic interpretation. We don't have it anymore. There's no surviving lessons or anything like that. This is one of the really, really lost secrets of Freemasonry, but what can you do? We can make new ones. Yeah, and you can read all about the 1734 lecture. Sean Iyer has a paper called A Dissertation Upon Masonry, where he sort of breaks it apart, and it is pretty strange. Okay, the third area of occult influence that I want to look at is the idea of moral and ethical improvement. Now, this is one of the core teachings in Freemasonry, and we have a lot of sort of like really plainly written out stuff about, here are the 7 virtues, here's the way that, Masons are supposed to act this way, Masons are supposed to do this. Like, we already have a lot of this sort of spelled out in plain text, in non-occult ways and non-esoteric ways. But we also have some really weird esoteric stuff having to do with moral and ethical improvement. Agrippa talks about this, and I think rather than showing that Agrippa influenced Freemasonry, I believe that Agrippa and Freemasonry instead have a common source for this. But Agrippa talks about the importance of a magician, of somebody who's harnessing occult powers. They must achieve a level of ritual purity and a certain level of virtue. He talks about the virtues of the gods, which are basically virtues attached to the 7 planets and the crystal spheres. He says, you must be joined to the virtues of the gods, without which we cannot happily ascend to the inquiry of secret things and to the virtues of wonderful operations. Agrippa literally quotes from Book 13 of the Corpus Hermeticum, which is a treatise on these powers and virtues that we must practice in order to overcome, like, vice. In order to, like, ascend through the crystal spheres and achieve a sort of divine apotheosis or something like that. Now in Freemasonry, we have almost the same thing. In Illustrations of Masonry, which was published in 1793 and reflects sort of like the current state of Masonry in England at the time, William Preston writes, he's writing about Jacob's ladder. Oh, I guess that's in here. And thither he hopes at last to arrive. Heaven, he hopes at last to arrive, by aid of the theological ladder which Jacob in his vision saw ascending from earth to heaven, the 3 principal rounds of which are denominated faith, hope, and charity, and which admonish us to have faith in God, hope in immortality, and charity to all mankind. This is frequently interpreted in Freemasonry as well, I mean, it doesn't even need to be interpreted. It's basically saying you practice these Masonic virtues, you will be able to ascend Jacob's ladder and reach heaven. It's basically Freemasonry's path to enlightenment, and it's well known. It's non-monitorial. It's monitorial. It's like printed out plainly in our ritual. All right. So, so Hermeticism. I believe that both of these passages were probably directly influenced by Book 13 of the Corpus Hermeticum. The first English translation of this happened in 1650. In that translation, it was the 7th book, titled His Secret Sermon on the Mount of Regeneration. And Everard, or I guess Hermes Trismegistus, lists 10 powers that, when practiced, allow the mystic to ascend through the tent of heaven and find unity with the divine. And they don't really have a whole lot of stuff in common with what we look at in Freemasonry, but I do have a list here from Everard's translation. Number 1 was the knowledge of truth. Number 2 is the knowledge of joy. Number 3 is temperance, then continence, then justice, then communion, truth, good, life, and light. Once you master those 10 powers, everything else is cream cheese. All right, so in conclusion, I think it's really, really hard, and I don't think that I've been able to show a clear path that outlines like a direct line from Agrippa's work to Freemasonry. I think, like I mentioned earlier, his work became so present in Europe, like it was everywhere. It got reprinted even in the United States later on too. Like it was just reprinted so often that it was just something that people had. So I think that there are themes you can find in both. I don't think that any of them are solely found in Agrippa, though. Like he wasn't necessarily, even though he was popularizing things and consolidating things in one place, I think that there's very little in Agrippa that's entirely unique or original to him. So even if he was writing about these ideas, he might not have been the one to do it. I do think, though, that one of the best lines of inquiry, one of the best things to try to dig into here, which I would encourage Masons to look at, is the influence of early Christian Kabbalah on Freemasonry. I don't know necessarily where you would find a line of transmission, where you would find a golden thread that would link them, but I think the link between the divine names and the secret methods of interpreting Scripture are really, really juicy morsels, and probably deserve a little more attention and digging than I had time to give them. So yes, that was my conclusion. I feel like I probably should have had a wrap-up conclusion sentence, like, I don't know. I do have a final slide. Right? Yes. Thank you. Oh. If you're interested in learning more about Agrippa and the 3 books of occult philosophy, I do have a 9-part documentary podcast that explores occult philosophy, its influences, where it came from, how to read it, et cetera, and you can find it at this giant URL that is only giant in size and not actually in number of letters. Does anybody have any questions or comments or rude things to say? I'd be cool with any of them. Yes, Damon.
Yeah, so I can definitely attest to the fact that Agrippa is something that a lot of people just have lying around. I have a copy of the 3 books lying around. And I also have a book, I think it's by Manly A. Hall, called How to Read Your Bible.
Oh.
So interpretation of the Bible by Masons and other occultists is also something that has definitely continued throughout the years.
For sure. Yes.
So those are my observations.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I mean, I guess and it's not just Masons who do that, I guess. That's just sort of an ongoing concern for lots of people, it seems like. Yeah. Any other questions or comments?
Hi. At a certain point, you described how, or you went into what you think of the relationship Agrippa saw between the outer light and the inner light. And I just wondered, is it in Agrippa that it distinguishes between two different kinds of lights, or is it just one light for Agrippa?
Book 1, chapter 24. Wait, hold on. It might be chapter 45. Book 1, chapter 45, and it goes on for like 3 chapters. But yeah, it's in there. He lays it out pretty plainly. I think that his theory of divine light was not necessarily like unique amongst sort of like occultists and scholars of the time. The best interpretation of it, or the best sort of like breakdown of it, I've found in Juan Culiano's book Eros and Magic in the Renaissance, where he talks about sort of like the phantasmal apparatus and the way others were interpreting divine light and talking about it at the time. You're welcome.
Yeah, actually, I thought that was the most interesting part of your talk, was the outer senses and the inner senses, and actually the inner senses and the way they affect how we perceive the world is kind of spot on, even with a lot of modern ideas of psychology. Like, it's actually not that different than how we think of how memory and imagination affect the way you end up perceiving all the things that come in. I thought that's really fascinating, actually.
Well, thank you. I think that's a fascinating subject too. I think I've spoken about it before in other lectures, and it sort of ties in really closely with the work I've done with like the art of memory and the talks that I've done on that. Yeah. Anybody else have any questions? All right. Well, thank you, everybody.